Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this session of the ReImagine Israel-Palestine Learning Corps. We're super lucky to have special guest Sari Bashi joining us today for a conversation on Gaza, and we'll just dive right in. So Sari is the current program director at Human Rights Watch, where she leads the organization's research on a whole host of areas in different countries. But before joining Human Rights Watch in her current role, Sari co-founded and ran Gisha, the leading Israeli human rights group promoting the right to freedom of movement for Palestinians in Gaza. She wears a lot of hats. She knows a lot about a lot of different topics. She's an expert in international humanitarian law, and hopefully you had a chance to check out some of her blog posts from her incredible blog, Forat, about raising her children in the occupied West Bank. So Sari, we're super lucky to have you here for this conversation today, and we're really glad to have you join us. You're on mute.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Telos for about 15 years. I am a good friend of Greg Khalil's and watched the process that emerged into what is now Telos. And it's wonderful to see the work that you're doing and how you're branching out and deepening the engagement that people have with Israel-Palestine. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. So for those on the call, why Gaza? This is an issue that we've talked about a little bit on previous calls together. It's one that's come up a couple of times, but we really wanted to offer an opportunity to dive deeper into this incredibly rich and diverse and complex topic on its own, but in conversation with all of the other topics we've touched on. So for those on the call who are less familiar, Gaza City is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. It had the second largest library in antiquity. It was a place of learning and rich culture. But then in 1948, around the Nakba, Gaza's population suffered tremendously when it essentially tripled overnight. And the influx of refugees and the inability to effectively absorb and really support so many new people in a deeply historic city really marked a shift in the area and the community. And the roots of some of the humanitarian and security concerns that we see today go back to that time. So I just want to flag that right up front. Gaza is a place of deep, rich history, way beyond any of the headlines we see today. But it's also important to look at some of the very real challenges it's facing in order to move towards what we advocate for: mutual flourishing, freedom, dignity, security, and especially human rights for Israelis and Palestinians in equal measure. So Sari, super excited to have you with us today, both because of your intellectual knowledge and expertise, but also because you occupy a really interesting positionality in Israel-Palestine in your identity, what you bring to this work. And I'm wondering if we could start the conversation just to give folks a little bit more insight into why this issue for you. Why was Gaza the issue that drew your attention both personally and professionally?
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for that background about Gaza. Gaza is a beautiful place, and that fact sometimes gets lost. So how do I start? I was born to an Israeli and American family. My father was born in Baghdad in Iraq, but like most Iraqi Jews, he fled in the wake of the 1948 war and settled in Israel. Where he grew up. My mother is an American Jewish person, and I grew up kind of going back and forth between the United States and Israel. And when I became an adult, I decided to spend some time in Israel to get to know the place better, to get to know a place that I knew from childhood visits, but didn't really have a good sense of what else it could be. I got a job as a journalist working for the Associated Press. This was 1998 to 2000, so the kind of the end of the Oslo period, and in which there was still optimism that maybe things could be a bit different, at least for some people. And I got a chance to witness a lot of things that were very interesting, but I also decided that I didn't want to just report on what I saw as problematic conduct by the Israeli authorities toward Palestinians. I also wanted to be able to take a side. So I decided to study law, and that's actually where I met Greg. He and I were classmates together at Yale Law School. And then I came back and clerked on the Israeli Supreme Court for the late Justice Edmund Levy. And then together with a much more senior colleague, Professor Kenneth Mann, I co-founded Gisha, the human rights organization. So I think, at the time, the restrictions on freedom of movement for Palestinians then and now had been a very prominent feature of the Israeli of the Israeli occupation, something that literally affects hundreds of thousands of people every day in terms of ordinary people struggling to get to work, to get to school, to be able to reunite with family members. And in 2005, which was around the time that that I co-founded Gisha, the Israeli government was implementing what it called its disengagement plan, in which it withdrew civilian settlements, Israeli settlements from Gaza, and its permanent ground presence, but then basically sealed the borders. So it was pretty clear this was going to be a problem. Gaza was not built to be an enclave. It had always been part of historic Palestine, with rich, deep cultural, economic, familial, and other ties to the rest of what had been mandatory Palestine, Israel, and the West Bank. And the ironic thing is that actually, although Gaza had been isolated for a relatively short period from 1948 until 1967, the Israeli occupation in 1967 actually allowed Palestinians from Gaza to reunite with many family members and friends from the West Bank and Israel. Because for the first 2 decades of the occupation, there was a policy of allowing freedom of movement, and in fact, erasing the boundaries between Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. That began to close off with the onset of the Oslo Accords. But the 2005 closure of Gaza was predicted to be very difficult for the people living there. And so I co-founded the organization Gisha together with Kenneth, just to give legal assistance to people. So I was a lawyer. Together with others, I represented Palestinians in Gaza who needed permits from the Israeli military in order to reunite with loved ones, go to school, access jobs. And then we expanded out beyond just legal assistance, also to doing public advocacy work and research to kind of demonstrate the effects of the travel restrictions on people in Gaza. The thing I should say about that is that in addition, well, it's related. So my professional expertise that I developed was freedom of movement. And at the same time, I developed a hobby, but a very serious one, of long distance running. So the year that I founded Gisha was the year I ran my first marathon. And as I deepened my work with Gisha, I began running longer and longer distances. So that first year, I think I ran 4 marathons. And eventually I began running ultra marathons, very long races, the longest of which was 216 kilometers or 134 miles. And for me, there was a real connection, and there still is a connection between my work and my running. So when you run for that long, for that many hours, you feel this amazing sense of freedom. You just cross boundaries, transgress different kinds of environments, and you do it in a way that makes you feel free. At the same time, I was representing people who didn't have that kind of freedom. And the other thing that I found really encouraging was that the process of thinking about how to run a very long race requires you to be humble and to just start one step in front of the other, slowly, with a lot of patience. And that's actually exactly how you do human rights work as well. So that worked as well.
No, absolutely. That's a great metaphor. And I can't fathom running that far. So that is superhuman to me. You touched on so many different themes that I hope we pick up on in the course of our conversation. But before we dive into those specifics, like this idea of freedom of movement or the lack of freedom of movement touches on pretty much every facet of life, from family reunification or visiting family in the West Bank and Gaza, to healthcare, to education, to just tourism and ability to visit holy sites in Jerusalem. Can you share a little bit more about what the consequence to Palestinian daily or weekly, yearly life is, to the social fabric of Palestinian society is, with this restriction of freedom of movement, and why it's such an important issue beyond, well, people just can't leave or move freely? Like, why is it so important to so many different facets of daily life?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think many of you are in the United States. So maybe
most of us are, yeah.
Okay, so I can use maybe an example from the US. So Gaza is about the size of the American city of Philadelphia, and it has a similarly sized population. There are about 2 million people in Gaza. And so imagine what would happen if tomorrow the governor of the state of Pennsylvania decided to close off Philadelphia. He decided to build a wall or a fence around the city of Philadelphia and have 2 gates, one for people and one for goods. And he would allow 200 people to cross every day in and out of the city of Philadelphia through a permit regime. And he would allow a certain number of trucks to enter the city and a smaller number of trucks to leave. And so the rules would be that if you wanted to see your mother in New Jersey, you probably wouldn't be able to. And maybe you could if you tried really hard to get a permit. If you wanted to access a hospital outside of the city of Philadelphia, it would be very difficult. If you wanted to just go to the symphony, you wouldn't be able to leave the city, and nobody from outside Philadelphia would be able to go to a show in Philadelphia. So pretty quickly, the city would start to wither. The economy would shut down. All the cultural richness of a city like Philadelphia would shut down. Nobody would come to the restaurant, so that would kind of collapse. And people would begin to experience really, really difficult hardship, because it's arbitrary to say that if your mother lives in New Jersey, you can't see her. So that's kind of what happened to Gaza. It happened over the course of years, beginning in the early 1990s with the Oslo Accords, where the Israeli government began to slowly close Gaza off from the rest of the world. So the Israeli government, the Israeli military, controls the airspace and the territorial waters of Gaza and doesn't allow people to travel by air or by sea. It also controls all of the crossings between Gaza, Israel, and the West Bank. There is one crossing to the Sinai Desert that Egypt controls, which allows some relief for people traveling abroad. There's a number of limitations, and it's also very difficult. It's very difficult to cross the Sinai. And so if people want to travel to jobs, to schools, they become very isolated. So Palestinian universities that had been established to serve all of Palestine in the way that American universities, US universities, are established to serve at least people in the region, became cut off. Beginning in 2000, students from Gaza were not allowed to study in West Bank universities, even though those universities had faculties and disciplines that you couldn't study in Gaza, like medicine, like occupational therapy. And nobody could come to join the universities in Gaza, not staff and not faculty. And it's been going on like that for quite some time, with a particularly harsh closure implemented in 2007. At various points, even the amount of food that was allowed into Gaza was restricted by the Israeli military. And so we can understand what that means, or maybe we can't. Young people have never left Gaza. Unemployment is at about 50%, and for women, it's about 60%. That's an underestimate because a lot of people have left the workforce. Wages are extremely low. There is humanitarian assistance that comes in, but people are deprived the right to engage in dignified work. The universities, the standards are problematic, because in the absence of people being able to travel to get education elsewhere, to bring in the kind of academic exchange you'd want for a vibrant university, it's very difficult to maintain a quality higher education under those circumstances. And maybe the most painful, acute part of it is the family separation. So the travel restrictions for Gaza are designed to further demographic goals of the Israeli government. The Israeli government wants to have a Jewish majority in Israel and the West Bank. And in 2005, when it withdrew Jewish settlers from Gaza, it gave up on its territorial claims to settle Gaza with Jews. And so what you have is an attempt to have as many Palestinians as possible in Gaza and not allow people from Gaza to come to Israel or the West Bank. So you have these terrible choices people have to make, especially women. So if a woman is from the West Bank and marries somebody from Gaza, it's culturally customary that she join her husband in Gaza. But then if her mother is sick, she won't be allowed to visit. Or if she is allowed to visit, it'll be conditioned on her not coming back to Gaza. And so she can choose between her mother or her child in ways that just don't make any sense. So it's really hard. And in the West Bank, there are other kinds of travel restrictions. There's a much more direct Israeli military presence, so people face checkpoints and incursions and seeing soldiers. It's a different kind of challenge. In Gaza, you don't usually have Israeli soldiers inside the strip, but their presence all around is very, very painfully felt.
Thanks for some of those stories illustrating the different ways it does affect daily life. I'm wondering if we can zoom out for a minute and talk a little bit more about the history, because I think it is really important to understand, not just for Gaza, but for the separation between Gaza and the West Bank, like attempting to separate it socially, but then also politically. So in 2005, 2006, with the disengagement, that came at the same time as Israel took all of the settlers out of Gaza, but that was part of a simultaneous expansion of settlements around East Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was an issue we touched on last month in this community, so we know a little bit about that. But can you give us any more context or anything you'd like to add around that, about kind of what happened in 2006? And the reason I'm asking you to share about this is, right, I was in 6th grade in 2006. So much of Gaza's population is incredibly young, that they were children in this time, right? They weren't part of the elections in 2006 that elected Hamas democratically. They weren't part of, right, the decision-making that set us up to where we are today. And yet they're bound by what happened, almost 20 years ago now, when they were kids or not even born yet. And so, yeah, I'd love for you to share more with me, with those of us on the call, about the importance of understanding how these two things are connected.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, for the first few decades of the occupation, Israel ruled Gaza and the West Bank directly. But then in 1994, with the signing of the Oslo Accords, it created the Palestinian Authority, which was supposed to be an interim, temporary body that would govern Gaza and the West Bank under circumstances in which independence or an end to the occupation had not been achieved. So you had a situation in which the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a freedom movement, became a governing movement because it morphed in some ways into the Palestinian Authority without having achieved liberation. And then when the interim period ended and the second intifada, or uprising, broke out in 2000, although any prospect of having increased autonomy or independence was not realistic, the Palestinian Authority decided to keep doing what it was doing, which was providing local governance. And so that was under Yasser Arafat. When he died in 2004, there were elections for a new president, and Mahmoud Abbas won those elections in 2005. And the following year, there were parliamentary elections. In those parliamentary elections, 2006, which were held across Palestine, so Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Hamas won a plurality of votes. So they got more than everybody else. They didn't get a majority. And what followed was a split government, where you had the Fatah faction, which had been Yasser Arafat's faction, controlling the presidency, and the Hamas faction controlling the parliament. There was a lot of fighting. There were different sanctions imposed on Hamas and on parts of the Palestinian government by Western actors and by Israel. And in 2007, those different attempts at unity broke down basically into a pretty bad internal fighting. And at the end of it, in June 2007, Fatah Yasser Arafat's faction controlled all of the West Bank in terms of the structures of local governance, and Hamas controlled all of the local governance structures in Gaza. And the Fatah people, many of them fled or were kicked out. So you had a split. A political split internally for Palestinians, and that spurred a tightening of the closure. Because the argument that the Israeli government made was that Gaza is now controlled by a hostile group, and so therefore it has the Israeli government is justified in engaging in what it called economic warfare. So this came out on a court petition that Gisha submitted, challenging some of the restrictions, including like deliberate restrictions on the sale of electricity or other fuel, and the ability to have even basic humanitarian items enter. And the response was, well, the Israeli government is authorized in waging economic warfare against Hamas by crippling the economy in Gaza. And it was, you could see how that played out in the way that the military protocols worked. So it took a long time, but through freedom of information laws, we were able to get lists of what was allowed into Gaza at that time between 2007 and 2010, and what was not allowed into Gaza. And you had things that would seem a little bit funny. So margarine in small packets was allowed into Gaza in certain quantities because it was considered a humanitarian item. People need to eat fat. margarine in large buckets was not allowed into Gaza because in those quantities, it was an input for the biscuit factory. And if you let it in, the biscuit factory would operate and there'd be an economy and people would have jobs. And that's what the policy was designed to prevent, basically. And so that's why a lot of people prefer to call Gaza a crisis of dignity as opposed to a humanitarian crisis, because people can sort of get the margarine, but they can't get the jobs that they need to get.
Yeah, that's super helpful context. One of the phrases that came to mind as you were sharing that I've heard used to describe the situation is collective punishment. I'll invite you to share a little bit more about that because you're the legal expert, not me. But it was a really helpful phrase for me to understand when I first started learning about this. And I want to bring in some of the questions about security in a minute. But that idea of, right, collectively punishing a whole group of people for the actions of a few or the political actions of the government in charge is both illegal under international law, but also, to me, deeply immoral. And as you said, right, gets at the need for the freedom, the self-determination, and the dignity in addition to security. Without those things, there is no security for anyone. So I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit more like what collective punishment is and how it might be functioning, as you just described, with some of this economic warfare.
Sure. No, thank you. Yeah, so collective punishment is unlawful under international law. It's when you punish people for acts they did not commit. And so there's different versions of it. In the West Bank, and the Israeli government will often demolish the home of somebody who is suspected of having committed an attack against Israelis. So even if that person is dead, they'll demolish the family's home. And the Israeli government says it's in order to achieve deterrence. There's no evidence that it does achieve deterrence, but even if it did, I mean, sure, we could punish the family members of somebody who does something we don't like, but that doesn't seem particularly fair. In Gaza, it was scaled up in the sense that the argument was that if rockets are fired, for example, from Gaza onto Israeli civilian areas in southern Israel, which is a war crime, there's no justification for it. Rather than addressing the people who are firing the rockets, or maybe the Hamas government, which has a responsibility to make sure those rockets are not fired, the Israeli government would close the civilian crossings and not let people travel for medical care, to see families, or not let goods in or out. So that's what we would call collective punishment. For a while, that was quite popular also among many Western governments. Not long after the closure in 2007, the Israeli government kind of successfully marketed a narrative that, you know, Hamas, which is exercising local control inside Gaza, is the incarnate of evil, and therefore anything that it does against people in Gaza is justified. And the rhetoric would be, well, they chose Hamas. So that's kind of a funny rhetoric, because it wasn't that the people in Gaza voted for Hamas any more than the people in the West Bank or East Jerusalem did. There were elections that were democratic, and Hamas won for a variety of reasons. But in any case, that rhetoric was used. And I'm actually proud that Gisha was able to undermine some of that rhetoric through kind of a funny story. We became aware that in the context of so many people being prevented from leaving Gaza, Fulbright scholars were also being prevented from leaving Gaza. So these were Palestinian young people who had achieved Fulbright grants, which is kind of hard to get. It's kind of impressive. But the US government was going to cancel those grants and withdraw the scholarships because it couldn't get them out. The Israeli government wouldn't let them out, not because of any particular security claim against them, just because it had sealed the borders shut as part of this collective punishment policy. And so we were able to get publicity, a front page story in the New York Times that made it to Condoleezza Rice. And that was a bit of a crack in that thinking that everybody in Gaza deserves to be punished. And so the Fulbright students were let out, and over time, more people were let out. And when that happened, the Israeli government changed the rhetoric from those people in Gaza deserve to be punished to, oh, it's such a shame. You know, we wish they didn't have to be under closure, but, you know, there's nothing we can do about it. It's all the fault of Hamas. So I would disagree with that. The Israeli government has made a choice to seal off Gaza. But even before that, it made a choice about the people living in Gaza, because 70% of the people living in Gaza are refugees and their descendants who fled or were expelled from homes in 1948 in what is now Israel. So those people who are in Gaza actually have a right to return to their homes in Israel if that's what they choose to do. And so not letting them do that closing them off, and then kind of blaming the economic collapse, blaming the social collapse on somebody else is, certainly the Hamas government is making lots of mistakes, and I don't particularly think they're rights respecting. But every authority needs to take responsibility for the actions that it takes, and the Israeli government is undertaking actions that are very problematic.
That's really helpful context. And again, so many threads I want to pick up on, but that leads me to this question of, at Telos, we talk about the need to self-interrogate, looking at the way we or our communities are, quote unquote, our side, are contributing to conflict or violence, so we can address it and try and ameliorate it. Gisha works with Israeli authorities through official channels, attempting to hold to account institutions and representatives of the state. What pushback or what response have you gotten, or has Gisha gotten? I know you're not with them anymore, but still very much connected. What response have you gotten from not just the Israeli government, but other Israelis who might not understand why this is an issue that you feel passionate about as Israelis? And how do you respond to those folks, doing some of the self-interrogating and inviting them to see that this isn't necessarily in the best interest, not just for lofty, human rights values, but very concretely also for their security?
Yeah. So for a long time, different armed Palestinian groups have been engaging in violence against Israeli soldiers, and also in some cases against Israeli civilians. In Gaza, for many years, there have been armed groups, particularly the Islamic Jihad, which is another faction, and Hamas, that have been firing rockets, missiles, and mortars against civilians in southern Israel, in surrounding towns, and sometimes further than that. It's a war crime. International law, international humanitarian law does not allow you to fire at civilians either deliberately or indiscriminately. In other words, we're just going to fire. We don't care where it lands. And in the West Bank, there are also organized acts of violence against Israeli soldiers, and in some cases also against Israeli civilians. So that's scary. And certainly Israeli residents are understandably angry and incensed at rockets being fired on southern Israel. They translate that into a request for security that's predicated on the Israeli government applying more violence. So when rockets are fired, you'll often hear responses, we need to flatten Gaza. We need to do lots of things. Aside from the fact that flattening Gaza, an area where the majority of people living there are children, would be reprehensible morally, legally, and in every other way. It's also not clear what the security strategy there is, because tit for tat violence is not shown to be particularly responsive to Israeli security concerns. And a lot of the work that both Gisha and Human Rights Watch do is to show the disconnect between the security rationale articulated and what the policy is actually doing. So, for example, we'll say, well, I understand that you think that the restrictions on people traveling back and forth is because of security concerns, but then explain to me why this same person is allowed to travel to the West Bank for a few days, maybe to attend the wedding of a first-degree relative, but she's not allowed to travel to the West Bank for a long period of time for her own wedding, because the policy is designed to keep Palestinians out of the West Bank and keep them in Gaza. And so maybe we'll let her come for 3 days, but we're not going to let her come to get married. Why students are, in some cases, allowed to travel abroad to study at foreign universities, but they're not allowed to travel to the West Bank to study in Palestinian universities in the West Bank, because the aim is demographic. So it's not that there aren't security concerns, and certainly the Israeli government has the authority to take measures to protect its security, but the travel restrictions are about much more than that. And that's another maybe framework that I can suggest, although I know that it's a difficult framework for a lot of people, but it's a framework that's increasingly becoming the lens through which people view what is going on in Israel-Palestine, and that's apartheid. So Human Rights Watch and many other organizations have in recent years followed the lead of Palestinian scholars and human rights activists in saying that the Israeli government is committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. Apartheid has a legal definition, and there are three elements to the crime. It's when you have the intent to have one racial group dominate another racial group in a context of systemic oppression and through the commission of inhuman acts. And we and others argue that the kind of treatment the Israeli government is subjecting Palestinians to, including home demolitions, forcible transfer, denial of basic civil and political rights, and in Gaza, the draconian travel restrictions, rise to the level of inhumane acts. And the intent is to achieve Jewish demographic supremacy, both within Israel as well as in the West Bank. And so the Israeli government is very clear about saying that the West Bank belongs to the Jewish people, and it wants to ensure a Jewish majority in as much of the land as it controls. And it's also passing various laws that are establishing Jewish supremacy as a matter of law. And that is it's very difficult. It does terrible things to Palestinians to be subject to that kind of domination. It does pretty terrible things to Israelis as well. Because, when you have a system of racial domination, I mean, I guess it's certainly worse to be the group being dominated, but it's no great privilege to be in the group that's doing the dominating. It does pretty bad things to the soul of a people. And I think that some of the erosions that we're seeing now of the procedural democratic elements that the state of Israel had are a result of that. Of really decades of just systematically trying to privilege one group over another in very difficult and violent ways.
Thanks so much for that context. And I think that truth that you landed on at the end, that everyone who's caught up in violent systems and violent logics is harmed, is one that's super important for us to remember as we work for freedom, dignity, security for everyone. And it's one we can see in our own country, right, in other contexts too. And I would say for some folks on this call, that language of apartheid might be new, or it might not be one they're as familiar with. And I just invite folks, right, if that's one that's newer for you, or if you had a gut reaction and you're maybe not so sure how you feel about the use of that language, to remember our second practice of peacemaking, which is holding perspectives in tension, to sit with everything Sari just shared and to think about, why that reaction is coming up, what's at stake for you if that language is pushing you in a direction where you're not quite so sure how you feel about it. And if you want more, research into that or some more conversation about why that language is being increasingly used by human rights organizations, happy to have a follow-up conversation about that. I know that can be a heavy label for some folks when they step into this space to start engaging. But so appreciate you, Sari, bringing it into the conversation and explaining a little bit more about why that is something that at Human Rights Watch you use as a metric to try and help evaluate, not just to name the problem, but then also to help people, right, move towards addressing it and solutions. So I just wanted to throw that note in there. One of our partners who came up for me as you were sharing this, her name is Rani Kedar. She lives down in Nativ HaAsra on the Gaza border. It sounds like you know her. She's an incredibly powerful partner for us and thought partner. For those who haven't had a chance to meet her in person or know her story, she lives really close to the border with Gaza, right? You stand in her village, you look over into Gaza, over the security wall and fence. And in her community, they have bomb shelters, right, that dot the community. And they regularly have, when the sirens go off, 15 seconds to run from potentially incoming rockets. And it's an environment that is incredibly scary, right, for families, for children, for the community. But what Roni always comes back to is, how can I deny for my neighbor what I want for myself? And, I'm telling her story a little bit, bringing her in, because I think she's a really powerful example of what we mean when we talk about mutual flourishing, that Roni, right, acknowledges, talks about she and her community can only live in freedom, dignity, security when her Gazan neighbors, her Palestinian neighbors can also live in freedom, dignity, and security, and they go hand in hand. So just wanted to bring in her story because I think she's a really good example of recognizing everything, Sari, that you just described and taking it and turning it into something really generative. And with that, I want to bring you back in. I feel like I've been talking a little bit too much now. But whenever I try and talk about Gaza, or when we encourage folks on this call to maybe expand communities about Palestinians into spaces where those conversations aren't happening, one of the biggest things I always get hit with is, well, what about Hamas? But Hamas. And, I hope folks are taking from this conversation some of the nuance we can talk about, but very strategically, Do you have any advice or suggestions for those of us who maybe want to try and bring some of this conversation to our communities, knowing that none of us are experts in this, right? We might not be able to define the legal ramifications or know all the history. What are some advice or suggestions you have for us as we try and engage in advocating for, right, an end to this crisis of dignity? I like that language, not humanitarian crisis, when that's often what we are met with whenever we try and bring up Gaza at all.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I don't feel qualified to answer it as well as I think many of you do, because you're much more expert in the communities in which you are engaging in this dialogue. And so I would first say, trust what you're doing, because if you're in this webinar and you're interested and you're affiliated with the kind of group that I know Telos to be, then I think you're probably doing more than I would know how to recommend. I can say that sometimes listening can be really helpful. And sometimes, as much as possible, trying to bring it home to basic idea, not basic, but simple ideas that people can understand. There's a lot of trying to make things very, very complicated in Israel-Palestine, including by reducing things to what I would say is a bit of a fetish about an ethno-religious conflict. So, the Arab-Israeli conflict, Arabs and Jews. And, sometimes you can just challenge people's ideas a little bit just with information. So first of all, I'm not really sure what the Arab-Jewish conflict is. I'm an Arab Jew. My father was born in Iraq, Arabic speaking, like in most Arab countries, there at least were Arab Christians, Arab Muslims, and Arab Jews. And in Israel, almost half of the Jews are actually of Arab descent. So it's not Arab versus Jew. Those were constructions. Constructed concepts that also people like, because people like to believe this is a conflict of ethnicity or a religious conflict between Islam and Judaism, even though for most of history, Islam and Judaism have actually had a pretty good relationship, certainly compared to Judaism and Christianity. So you can kind of interrogate some of those assumptions and then also look at some of the structures, right? So it's not a conflict between two countries or two peoples. There is one authority, the Israeli government, that is exercising control and sovereignty over an entire space. And it's treating people very, very differently. And that's kind of the essence of racial domination. And, in terms of it being simple, there's a story that I can tell that maybe will maybe position me, answer your invitation to position myself in this. So I'm an Israeli American Jew. I have married a Palestinian from Gaza, from a refugee background. So my mother-in-law was forced out of her home in southern Israel and fled to a refugee camp in Gaza, and that's where my partner grew up. And we're raising our kids together in the West Bank. And so as a Palestinian Jewish family in the West Bank, it's complicated. Certainly, or my kids are a little bit older, but not that much. And when they were small, I would have to find ways of explaining things, especially to my daughter, who's the older one. And so from a pretty early age, she learned that Baba, her father, can't come with us to the sea, or can't come with us to family events in Tel Aviv, or can't come with us to a restaurant in Tel Aviv. And if she would ask me why, I would say, well, there are soldiers who are standing at checkpoints and they're having trouble sharing. And so they're only letting some people through, and they're not letting Baba through. And Ima and Baba don't agree and think everybody should be allowed through. And so this was the story that I would tell her. And one day, when she was 5 years old, I was driving with her and her brother from the West Bank into Tel Aviv for a family event. And her father didn't come with us because he can't. Palestinians are not allowed into Israel. And as we were driving, there was a surprise checkpoint. Basically, soldiers were standing in the road and they weren't letting cars exit a Palestinian area. So I had to turn back. And so I'm driving and I start to turn back, and she asked me why I'm turning back. And I said, well, you remember those soldiers who are standing at checkpoints and having trouble sharing? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, they're not letting us through, so we have to go back. And she said to me, but Ima, we're Jews. And that was actually the first time that I'd heard her refer to herself as Jewish. She knew I'm Jewish, but I had never told her Jews can and Palestinians can't. But she did what every 5-year-old does. She looked around at the world and she pieced together the situation based on all these data points. And at the age of 5, what she pieced together is that Jews can and Palestinians can't. And that's why it was confusing to her when we couldn't, because she knows I'm Jewish. And that is the essence of apartheid. Jews can and Palestinians can't. I don't want to say it's simple, but it actually is simple. And so the solution is also simple. Universalism. You dismantle that. And that means doing things like letting Palestinian refugees return to their homes or resettle where they are if that's what they want. Dismantling the systems that discriminate against Palestinians in favor of Jews. And maybe on a level of consciousness, trying to pick apart this idea that, Jews and Arabs, first of all, are distinct classes when they're not, but also that there's some ingrained conflict, religious, ethnic, I don't know what. There actually isn't. There's a system of oppression that exists here. And I'm sorry to say there are systems of oppression all over the world. They're each unique and they all kind of look like each other. And the way that we dismantle it is the way we dismantle any system of power. We hold those in power accountable and we fight with our values and with justice. And that it's not going to win you a lot of conversations with people who feel very strongly about the situation, but it can help sometimes just to encourage people to challenge their assumptions. And sometimes information can be helpful as well.
It's an incredibly powerful story. And I thank you for sharing personally, Sari. I think that the power of story and narrative is when we recognize at Telos. And I can't quote the poem that Greg quotes, but it's about story is both cage and key. And we tell stories to put people in cages, but then we can tell other stories to break down those cages and get to a place where we are doing that work of dismantling violence and violent systems. The other piece I wanted to add in was, I don't know who said this on the Telos team at first, but it's been really helpful to me as I think about both my own learning, but then teaching other people, simplicity on the other side of complexity. It is as simple, as you were teaching your daughter. It doesn't mean that those complexities don't exist. It doesn't mean that the first, 40 minutes of this conversation weren't important, but we don't need to get bogged down in some of that complexity when sometimes it is that simple. And I'd say, I hope other people have had a chance to read some of your incredibly powerful blog posts, but I have bookmarked those to send to some friends I have, when this conversation comes up again, because it's really hard to argue with someone's experience or someone's story. And again, that goes back to holding all of these different perspectives or narratives in tension. Each one drops a little bit of new perspective for folks who maybe think they have it all figured out, or they can't change their opinion or perspective out of self-interest, and using those stories, leaning into them and sharing them where we have heard them and have access, that's what our trips are founded on too. It's the go and see, come home and tell and share. And so I really appreciate not just you doing your work as an educator here with us today, or as someone who works at Human Rights Watch, but the vulnerability and bravery it takes to tell those personal family stories in a community and society where those really go against the grain, incredibly powerful, and super grateful for voices like yours that do that, because that's such an important part of this cultural work. Want to bring in some other voices now. If you've got questions, please put them in the chat and I'll invite you to unmute. Sari, I'm guessing we've got some folks who might also want you to weigh in on some of what's happening right now with the government. If you feel equipped to do that, go ahead. If not, I would not be able to put on the spot like that, so I don't want to back you into a corner that we haven't talked about preparing. But that's the first question that came through, is asking you to share a little bit about the Israeli Supreme Court situation, and in the context of today, if you could, not just share about that, but maybe talk a little bit about what you see that as meaning for Palestinians, or how that intersects with the conversation we've been having today about dignity and human rights. Would love to open some space for that as other folks get questions in the chat.
Sure. So, as many of you know, there have been massive and impressive protests against attempts to change certain elements of the Israeli system that would weaken judicial independence and judicial oversight. And this is in the context of a fairly extreme nationalist, populist government. And, an important part of that context is that the prime minister is on trial for corruption-related charges, and he is in a very weakened position. because he wants to stay out of jail and he wants to hold on to power. And so he has assembled a very, very right-wing government, coalition partners that he's beholden to. Those coalition partners include people who, had been arrested for violent nationalist extremist acts, and now they're in charge of the police and the military. So it's a very difficult situation. In terms of what that means for Palestinians, there is already increased violence, and it's getting worse and more decentralized. So within the West Bank, for example, there are 600,000 Israeli settlers who've been moved there by the Israeli government, and there also are Israeli soldiers. There has always been a very high level of baseline level of violence in the West Bank, with incursions at night, arrests, unlawful use of lethal force by soldiers in the West Bank, and also settler violence. But now the settler violence is being particularly encouraged by the military and other security forces. And the government officials in charge of reining in that violence belong to the groups that are perpetrating that violence. By belong, I don't mean they're part of an armed group. I mean, they belong to the political milieu. Those are their voters. And so when you have, for example, Jewish settlers engaging in riots, burning down homes and property, hurting Palestinians in the village of Hawara, you have government ministers backing them up in ways that are increasing violence. And so in the short term, I would expect to see more deaths and more people hurt, because you don't have people at the top reining it in on the Israeli side. And it's also becoming more decentralized. So violence by soldiers against Palestinian civilians is scary. Violence by Israeli settlers against Palestinian civilians is even scarier, because that's a lot harder to rein in once you let that out. On the Israeli side, you have a lot of Israeli citizens who are concerned about erosion of judicial independence, other aspects of procedural democracy that they see this government is trying to undermine. And many see it as being motivated, at least in part, by the prime minister's desire to stay out of jail. And so you have mass protests, but you also have a government that is continuing to move forward with some of these changes. So this week, what was passed was a law that restricts the ability of the Supreme Court to invalidate governmental decisions based on reasonableness. So many people feel like that's of concern, because it would allow, for example, the prime minister to appoint his daughter to be the police minister if he wanted, and it would be much more difficult for the court to intervene, even if something appeared to be patently unreasonable. Or as one opposition politician said, if you choose to take away the criteria of reasonableness that could, put limits on an action, it's probably because you want to do something unreasonable. And so those protests are continuing, and they've been now accompanied by different groups within Israeli Jewish society, doctors, army reservists, trade unionists, calling for strikes and stopping to cooperate with various parts of the Israeli government in an attempt to try to end the changes to the judicial system.
And a follow-up question from Tom, for those protesting against this judicial overhaul, he asks, do they simply want things to go back to quote unquote normal, or are they more in tune with Palestinian rights? And I'd love you to speak into that question, but then also, again, as you feel comfortable, share a little bit more maybe about some of the ongoing conversations about, right, is it democracy with occupation, right? These things are fundamentally in tension. As you've described over the course of this conversation, right, bringing in some of those ideas of apartheid, they're fundamentally against some of the democratic values. So it would invite you to respond as you'd like to that question of how protesters are responding and how it may or may not be in tune with the need for advocating around Palestinian rights.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a slippery question. Certainly most protesters do not see themselves as fighting for Palestinian rights, and there have been various uneasy tensions between protesters, for example, who've come to demonstrations with Palestinian flags, protesters who have held up signs saying There is no democracy with occupation, calling for an end to apartheid, and other protesters waving big Israeli flags saying, no, 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 you're undermining what we're trying to do. We're trying to fight for Israeli democracy. So yes, there are a lot of protesters who want things to go back to normal. Normal being a situation in which there are pretty decent civil and political rights for Israeli citizens, much more so for Israeli Jewish citizens, as opposed to the Palestinian minority within Israel, people who are Palestinian but they have citizenship, but a complete lack of any democracy for Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza. And just for perspective, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, that part of this land that used to be mandatory Palestine, Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, there are about 7 million Jews and there are about 7 million Palestinians. And so when you are systematically oppressing half of those people, I wouldn't say that the Israeli system doesn't have many democratic elements, but calling it a democracy would be challenging. And I think that the one thing that I think is happening is that because the elements of the Israeli system, political system, that had always been anti-democratic are now becoming more are flourishing, are blossoming. You do have some people questioning the system. You do have some people saying, wait a minute, what is it actually that we're fighting for? And that's where there's a lot of hope for people to not just want things to go back to the way they were 5 years ago, but to actually say, you know what, this is a system that's being eroded by aspirations of racial dominance. And maybe we need to rethink what it means for us to be safe, what it means for us to feel like we want a Jewish homeland. And is there another way to do it?
Yeah, those are super important questions. And I haven't heard the episode yet because they recorded it this morning. But for those of you on the call who regularly listen to the Telos check-in, my colleagues David and Ellie recorded an episode this morning on this subject and talking a little bit more about Telos and how we might ask these questions and think about this. So be on the lookout for that in the coming days if you want to dive into this conversation a little bit more. And I think we also have an episode from a couple weeks ago that goes more into what Sari was describing with some of the settler violence in the village of Huara. And so if you missed some of those headlines or that conversation, I'd encourage you to go back and take a little bit of a listen and deep dive into some of that. My colleague Jack on that one really talks about the impact of that on him and his family, right, as Palestinians on the community. And so those are both great resources for further learning. Couple questions came in while you were talking, and I'm not the best multitasker. This one's shifting back a little bit to the effect of violence on Gazans. So I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. One of the tensions that always comes out, going back to Roni's story, is that she and her community have bomb shelters, and it's terrifying to need them, but they have them. Where for folks in Gaza, there is nowhere to go, and there's no warning system before missiles come in. So there's a disparity, right, in the experience of some of that there. But then after the fact, you shared a little bit about, right, margarine packets versus tubs. It has an economic effect. But can you share a little bit more about the impact on Gazans after right, missile barrages or I don't know what the word to use right now is, but after, right, sustained attacks on Gaza, when homes have been destroyed, schools have been destroyed, the restrictions, some of the items to come in and rebuild, and the impact that has is something this question is asking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very difficult. And I think the part that's hardest is for children, because as parents, you can't protect them. And so, I have colleagues who, when there are onslaughts, one colleague in particular, he and his wife sleep in separate rooms so that if a bomb hits one part of the house, their children won't be orphans. And those are the kinds of decisions that people are making, people running around from house to house, like sleeping one night here, and then maybe I'll go to a relative because they're further away from this government building, but oh, there's a militant who lives nearby. It's not fair. And I can maybe more identify with what it is for the parents because I'm a mom. It's much harder to imagine what it is for the children. I can just say that, there are mental health providers and other experts who document very high levels of trauma among children, and also among children in Sderot, in southern Israeli communities, where they grow up having to run into bomb shelters and knowing that it's because a rocket could fall on their house.
And again, to me, that just goes back to, right, everyone is harmed in the current situation, children on both sides, people on both sides in so many different ways. And that's not to equate the experience or the impact of the violence. But really, for me, it points back to why we advocate for mutual flourishing, because right now, neither Palestinians nor Israelis actually experience freedom, dignity, security, human rights to the degree in which we'd like to see them. Any final questions for Sari before we end this call together? And while we're waiting to see if anyone has any, Sari, any final thoughts or calls to action that you'd like to leave us with coming out of this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like you know better than I do how you can best influence your communities. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for that commitment. You know, none of this would be possible without the United States government. So the US is part of the problem, but it also is a huge part of the solution. And so the work you're doing is in many ways more important than the work that I'm doing. And I want to thank you for doing it.
Yeah, it's a good reminder for everyone on this call, right? We've talked about this before in past sessions. We'll continue to talk about it, but it's not a question of if we're involved, but how. And as Americans, we do have unique opportunity in our communities to affect both that culture change, but then also to try and push and hold our government accountable when there are opportunities. So yeah, that's a great note to end on. And I am so grateful for you taking the time today to come share more about your work, the challenges, the crisis of dignity facing Gaza and Gazans, the apartheid situation Palestinians find themselves in, but then also to share a little bit more of the story of your experience of this, and to, I hope, offer folks insight into opportunities for being peacemakers, as we would describe it. It's really hard to hear some of this and to dive into the violence, but it's really important to see the world and the situation the way it is before we can transform it. So I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to everyone else who took the time today. And thank you for this conversation. And we look forward to seeing everybody else on the next session.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody. Bye.
Take care.
Thank you.
MJ, thanks for recording. Feel free to end and then we'll close out.